100,000 members, 9 campuses across the Dallas-Fort Worth area, $155 million in annual revenue. Gateway Church wasn't just a megachurch, it was an empire. Robert Morris, the founding pastor, was a best-selling author, a spiritual advisor to President Trump, broadcast to millions worldwide. His message was simple: give, and God will bless you. For 2 decades, it worked. Then, June 2024, a woman named Cindy Clemisher came forward. Between 1982 and 1987, when she was 12 years old, Morris, then a married youth pastor in his 20s, sexually abused her. October 2025, Morris pleaded guilty to child sex abuse. Within months, Gateway lost 40% of its donations. Mass layoffs followed. Campuses closed. The secret, church elders had known since 2005. They called it restoration. The victim was never contacted. They built an empire on blessing. The foundation was a lie. Gateway Church opened its doors in 2000 in Southlake, Texas, a wealthy suburb northwest of Dallas. Robert Morris, then in his late 30s, launched the church with a handful of families and a clear vision: build something bigger than anyone had seen before. By 2020, Gateway had become one of the 10 largest churches in America. 100,000 members spread across 9 campuses throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. The main Southlake campus alone featured a 7,000-seat sanctuary, a $60 million facility with stadium seating, massive LED screens, and production values that rivaled concert venues. Weekly attendance across all campuses hit between 25,000 and 30,000. Multiple services every Sunday. Parking teams directing traffic like stadium events. Inside, in professional worship bands, theatrical lighting, sermons broadcast in high definition to overflow rooms and satellite locations. The scale was staggering, larger than most entertainment venues. More weekly participants than many small towns had residents. But building something this big requires more than vision. It requires cash flow. Constant, massive, predictable cash flow. Gateway's 2023 tax filings showed $155 million in annual revenue. The number represented the culmination of carefully constructed revenue streams, each designed to sustain and expand the empire. Tithes and offerings formed the foundation. 10% of income, the biblical mandate Morris preached relentlessly. With tens of thousands of attendees and middle to upper class demographics in the Dallas suburbs, the math worked powerfully in the church's favor. The book sales added another dimension. Morris's The Blessed Life, published in 2002, became a multi-million copy bestseller. The book's core message, that tithing unlocks God's financial blessing, became Gateway's theological identity. Every new member was encouraged to read it. Small groups studied it. The royalties flowed back to Morris personally. Speaking fees brought Morris 5 figures per appearance at conferences nationwide. Gateway's annual conferences drew thousands, generating ticket revenue, vendor fees, and sponsorships. The staff numbered over 1,000 employees across 9 campuses. Professional management structures, HR departments, marketing divisions, media production teams. By the 2000s, Gateway operated less like a traditional church and more like a multimedia corporation with a spiritual mission. The prosperity message was everywhere. God blesses givers. Give first. Expect abundance. The message was about blessing. The business model required belief. Robert Morris built a brand that extended far beyond Southlake. By 2016, he sat on President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, joining a select group of high-profile pastors with direct political access. Media appearances multiplied. TBN broadcast his sermons. His podcast drew millions of downloads. Social media followings reached into the millions. The personal lifestyle raised few questions at the time. Public property records from 2015 showed a home purchase in Southlake exceeding $1 million. Private travel was documented, though Morris didn't own aircraft, designer suits, the trappings of success. Morris consistently framed it as stewardship, not wealth. He took a salary, amount undisclosed due to church tax exemptions, but emphasized he was careful with God's resources. The gap existed, but didn't generate sustained criticism. Luxury paired with "give and God will bless you" teachings created optical tension, but prosperity gospel critiques focused on theology generally. not Morris specifically. Then, 2014, during a sermon series on overcoming the past, Morris publicly discussed a moral failure from his 20s. He called it sexual sin. He said he'd been restored through accountability. Church elders vouched for the process publicly. No specifics were given. The congregation heard adultery, perhaps, a consensual mistake long ago resolved. But what Morris called restoration would later be revealed as something else entirely. June 14, 2024, a woman named Cindy Clemisher, now 54 years old, published detailed allegations on the Wartburg Watch, a Christian accountability blog, and spoke to multiple Christian news outlets simultaneously. The timeline she described, 1982 to 1987. Morris was 21 to 25 years old, a married youth pastor at a church in Oklahoma. Clemisher was 12 to 16. She babysat his child. The abuse, she said, was repeated and continued for years. Morris's initial response, through Gateway, acknowledged a moral failure decades earlier. The church maintained Morris had gone through a restoration process and been held accountable. But the evidence Clemisher provided told a different story. She'd never been contacted during any restoration process. No victim advocacy was involved. No one asked her experience, her trauma, or sought reconciliation. Social media erupted within hours. The Gateway members expressed shock, confusion, anger. Local Dallas news picked up the story by the next day. The question formed immediately: how can restoration occur without the victim's involvement? Biblical reconciliation requires engaging the offended party. Accountability without the abused person isn't accountability. It's concealment with spiritual language. But the church's response was just beginning. Between June 15th and 18th, Gateway's elder board released multiple statements. The messaging evolved rapidly as public pressure mounted. Initially, the elders maintained Morris had been restored through a biblical accountability process. They claimed to have learned of the issue in 2005, 19 years after the abuse ended, and implemented appropriate discipline and oversight. On June 18th, in 4 days after the allegations went public, Morris stepped down from the pulpit. The announcement framed it as voluntary, a decision to allow an independent investigation. The language shifted with each statement. First, moral failure, then, inappropriate relationship. Finally, acknowledging the victim had been a minor. Damage control included hiring an outside investigative firm and promising full transparency. But the timeline discrepancies were already visible. Clemisher provided contemporaneous evidence, journals from the 1980s, therapy records from the 1990s, documenting the trauma. Christianity Today, the Roy's Report, and the Dallas Morning News ran detailed investigations. The story went national within a week. Third-party fact-checkers noted that biblical restoration typically requires victim involvement. The Gateway's process included none, and then the legal process began. July through October 2024 brought cascading consequences. Attendance across Gateway's 9 campuses dropped 20 to 30% within weeks. A criminal investigation opened in Oklahoma, where the abuse began, though statute of limitations questions complicated prosecution. National outlets picked up the story. CNN and NBC covered the megachurch abuse cover-up angle. The narrative shifted from one pastor's sin to institutional failure. Internal documents, later leaked to reporters, revealed the elders had known since 2005. They chose private discipline over public disclosure. Morris continued building Gateway into a national platform while the secret remained contained. Legal experts noted that Oklahoma's mandatory reporting laws in the 1980s were unclear, but by 2005, Texas had clear requirements when credible abuse allegations surface. October 2025, Robert Morris pleaded guilty to child sex abuse charges. The plea deal was sealed due to the victim's age at the time, but the guilty plea itself became public record. But this wasn't the first time Gateway had faced uncomfortable questions. Gateway's financial records, available through 990 tax forms, showed $155 million in revenue for 2023. That figure represented a decline from a peak of approximately $185 million in 2019. Morris's personal compensation wasn't itemized. Churches enjoy broad exemptions from disclosure requirements, but the lifestyle suggested substantial income. The $1.2 million Southlake home, purchased in 2015, visible in public property records. Additional properties linked to Morris family trusts. The prosperity teaching Morris built Gateway on was explicit. The Blessed Life sermon series and book presented tithing as the key to unlocking God's financial blessing. Give 10% minimum, and God will multiply it back. Documented testimonies from former members described pressure to tithe despite personal financial hardship. The message was clear: if you're not experiencing breakthrough, perhaps you're not giving enough. In 2020, Gateway received between $2 and $5 million in PPP loans, according to SBA data. The church had significant cash reserves. The optics were questionable even then. Post-scandal, the financial collapse was swift. By November 2024, internal finance committee notes leaked to reporters suggested donations had dropped 40%. The money was supposed to fund ministry, but ministry requires truth. The theological critiques came swiftly after the scandal broke. Dr. Scott McKnight, a respected New Testament scholar, wrote in Christianity Today that prosperity gospel creates power structures without accountability mechanisms. When financial success is framed as evidence of God's favor, questioning leadership becomes questioning God. Russell Moore, editor of Christianity Today, stated bluntly in July 2024, "This isn't about theology, it's about abuse, enabled by unchecked power." Wade Burleson, a Baptist pastor and advocate for abuse survivors, documented Gateway's governance structure in detail. The elder board was appointed by Morris, not elected by congregation. Decision-making authority concentrated in the founding pastor. No denominational oversight existed. Gateway was independent, self-governed. The restoration without victim problem was fundamentally theological. Biblical reconciliation, as outlined in Matthew 18 and other passages, requires engaging the offended party. Morris's 2014 public confession framed the sin vaguely, letting the congregation assume consensual adult misconduct. The recontextualization was devastating. What the church heard as adultery was actually child abuse. The concealment wasn't just institutional, it was embedded in how the story was told. But the theological failures were symptoms of deeper structural issues. A pattern emerged when the timeline was laid out chronologically. 2005, Gateway's elders learned of the abuse allegations. They chose private discipline, removing Morris from ministry temporarily, implementing accountability structures over public disclosure or victim contact. In 2007 to 2014, Morris rebuilt and expanded Gateway. The church grew from regional to national influence. Revenue climbed. Campuses multiplied. 2014, Morris made a vague public confession during a sermon series on overcoming past mistakes. He called it moral sin in his 20s, claimed full restoration. The congregation accepted it. No media scrutiny followed. 2016, Morris was named to Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. The appointment brought high-profile validation and access. 2020, Gateway received PPP loans despite significant assets. Minor controversy at the time, recontextualized later as a part of institutional self-preservation. 2024, Clemisher went public. The concealment collapsed. 2025, Morris pleaded guilty to child sex abuse. Each decision to conceal compounded institutional vulnerability. At some point, protecting the ministry became indistinguishable from protecting the abuser. The plea deal was sealed, but the fact of guilt was public record. Callback: remember that $155 million annual revenue? It was funded by people taught to give sacrificially, while leadership hid the truth. And then, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Cindy Clemisher gave interviews throughout 2024 describing decades of trauma, therapy starting in her 20s, PTSD, the weight of carrying a secret while watching her abuser build a global platform. Her public statement was direct. "I was told God would use my pain. I was 12 years old. There was no restoration for me. No one asked how I was. No one sought reconciliation. I watched him become famous while I dealt with the damage." Former Gateway staff members, speaking anonymously to Christian outlets, described a culture of unquestioning loyalty. "We were told to trust leadership. Don't ask difficult questions. Submit to authority." Congregants who left after the scandal shared experiences with reporters. We gave everything: time, money, trust. We structured our finances around tithing. We believed the promise of blessing. We were lied to for 20 years. The aftermath brought institutional collapse. Mass layoffs hit in November 2024. The Dallas Business Journal reported 30 to 40% of staff cut. 2 of 9 campuses closed by early 2025. Weekly attendance dropped from 25,000 to 30,000 to an estimated 10,000 to 15,000. The rhetoric had been family. The reality was institutional self-preservation. But Gateway wasn't an isolated case. The entire megachurch model was fracturing. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research defines a megachurch as any Protestant congregation with 2,000 or more weekly attendees. By that standard, Gateway sat in the top tier nationally, but the economic reality is unforgiving. 100,000 members and a $155 million budget meant massive fixed costs. 9 campuses carried mortgages or lease payments. 1,000 staff required salaries and benefits. Production expenses for Sunday services alone ran tens of thousands weekly. The trap is structural. You need crowds to generate revenue. You need spectacle to draw crowds. Spectacle costs money, which requires more revenue, which demands bigger crowds. Gateway's model was personality-driven. Robert Morris was the brand. His teaching, his books, his face on marketing materials. The church's identity was inseparable from the founder. Governance structures concentrated power accordingly. Morris appointed the elder board. He controlled decision-making. No denominational oversight existed to provide external accountability. When the leader falls in this model, the institution faces catastrophic single-point failure. There's no separation between person and brand. Gateway became a case study in systemic vulnerability. One man's sin collapsed a $100 million institution, and Gateway wasn't the first megachurch to collapse under scandal. Mars Hill Church in Seattle dissolved in 2014 after allegations of abusive leadership against founding pastor Mark Driscoll. At its peak, Mars Hill had 15 locations and 13,000 weekly attendees. Within months of the scandal breaking, the entire network shut down. Hillsong Church, the global Pentecostal phenomenon, contracted dramatically between 2020 and 2022, following moral failures by Carl Lentz and financial irregularities involving founder Brian Houston. Campuses closed worldwide. Attendance plummeted. Willow Creek Community Church saw founding pastor Bill Hybels resign in 2018 amid sexual misconduct allegations. The church survived, but diminished significantly in influence and size. Ravi Zacharias International Ministries dissolved in 2020 after posthumous revelations of sexual abuse spanning decades. The pattern repeated: charismatic leader, concentrated power, accountability vacuum, concealed abuse. Protection mechanisms were consistent: loyalty-based boards, non-disclosure agreements, spiritual authority claims that discouraged questioning. When the brand equals the person, then the person's fall destroys the brand instantly. Gateway's Blessed Life brand was Morris. October 2025's guilty plea made the brand radioactive. But maybe the issue wasn't just bad leaders. Gallup data tracking religious attendance shows steady decline since the 1990s, with acceleration after 2020. The pandemic broke weekly church habits for millions. Many never returned. Megachurch-specific data from the Hartford Institute shows growth stalled in the 2000s. By 2020, many large churches were already contracting. Scandals accelerated existing trends. Gateway's post-scandal numbers told the story clearly. 40% donation decrease by November 2024, according to leaked Finance Committee documents. Attendance collapsed from 25,000 to 30,000 weekly to an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 by early 2025. 30 to 40% staff cuts. 2 of 9 campuses closed, with more under review. The symptom extended beyond scandal. Younger generations were leaving institutional religion entirely. Pew Research data from 2023 showed 30% of Americans under 30 identified as religiously unaffiliated. Prosperity gospel became a particularly hard sell when leaders lived luxuriously while concealing abuse. Empty seats were visible in social media photos from Sunday services. Were people leaving Robert Morris or the model itself? Perhaps the real question wasn't about one pastor's sin. By early 2025, Gateway Church still operated, but the empire had collapsed into something much smaller and more fragile. Robert Morris was gone, his guilty plea in October 2025 ending any possibility of return. An interim leadership team managed operations. Attendance hovered around 10,000 to 15,000 weekly, a 60% drop from peak. The financial situation remained dire. 40% revenue loss forced survival mode cuts. 7 of the original 9 campuses remained open, but consolidation seemed inevitable. The physical infrastructure still stood. Buildings, equipment, systems. A loyal core still attended. Children's programs continued, but the moral credibility was gone. The national influence evaporated. The growth trajectory reversed sharply. Gateway attempted rebranding, trying to separate Gateway Church from Robert Morris's Gateway Church. The effort felt desperate. Victim advocacy groups worked with survivors. Outside investigations continued. Morris's sentencing remained pending, the case sealed due to the victim's age. And compared to 2019, when Gateway ranked in the top 10 U.S. churches, 2025 looked like institutional survival, not thriving ministry. 100,000 members. In 2019, that number meant influence. In 2025, it was a ghost statistic. So what was it all for? The question isn't rhetorical. Thousands of people encountered genuine faith through Gateway over 2 decades. Testimonials exist, lives changed, families restored, hope discovered. Those experiences were real for the people who lived them. The contradiction is equally real. The empire was built on a foundation of concealed child abuse. The leader who preached about God's blessing hid a crime for 40 years. Church elders chose institutional protection over truth. The theological question remains unresolved. Can God's work happen through deeply compromised institutions? Is Gateway's ministry real despite Morris's sin, or fundamentally tainted by the foundational lie? Both narratives have evidence. The truth resists simplification. The human cost was devastating. Clemisher carried 40 years of trauma while watching her abuser achieve fame. Congregants who gave sacrificially felt betrayed at the deepest level, but others found genuine community and transformation. That's complicated, not erased by scandal. The institutional reality is clear. The megachurches concentrate power, create accountability vacuums, and enable abuse when governance fails. The spiritual claim is they're supposed to be different. They built an empire on blessing. Who was blessed? When the foundation is a lie, what happens to everything built on it? The campuses are still there. Some people still gather on Sundays, and services still happen. The machinery continues, diminished but operational. But the thing that filled those spaces, trust in leadership, belief in the message, faith that someone was watching and the institution was safe, that's what October 2025 destroyed. You can't rebuild that with a sermon series or a rebranding campaign. Trust, once shattered at this scale, doesn't reassemble easily, maybe not at all. Gateway Church will either slowly fade or transform into something unrecognizable from its peak. Either way, the empire Robert Morris built is gone. What remains is a question about what we build religious institutions on and who pays the price when the foundation cracks. What do you think should happen to Gateway Church now? Share your thoughts below.